Hello, hello, and welcome back to another Hallowoods backstage live stream, behind the scenes Q&A extravaganza affair Palabaloza. Thank you so much for, as always, tuning into the show, and then occasionally to behind the scenes content like this as well. In as much as we are behind the scenes, this is the living room in which Hallowoods episodes are often written, which is as much of a backstage as we really have. So that said, it has been an exciting week for the show, as it usually is for me, because I'm very excited to work on the show. Mostly at this point, figuring out the outline and really hammering in all the fine details for what the back half of this season requires. We are, I think, at this point, exactly halfway through season 4. So there's another 15 episodes or so to sort of sketch out and begin to pull into view as we begin to move into kind of the back half of the action, and bring us up to a thrilling finale for this somewhat noir detective mystery, which will be great. In the meantime, if you are watching this Q&A in the present day in the YouTube section, or if you click over to YouTube, wherever you're watching this, you can likely find the sort of sidebar chat. If you like, you can type questions in there and I'll answer them during the call as soon as I can. If you are a patron folk, there's also a patrons ask box that you can access through the Patreon side of things. It's usually in the episode description, more or less. And you can type questions in there in advance as well. And we do have a couple of those today to answer that have been asked throughout this week. If you are a patron in the far future and you're watching this for research purposes, there's probably another Q&A happening. You can submit questions for those if you like. That said, yes, so behind the scenes at the moment is really just outlining for the rest of the season. I think the outline is pretty much set at this point, just getting more detailed notes on what happens in each episode, as opposed to like sort of one sentence descriptions, which is often what the rougher stage of the outline looks like. But now it's time for all the details and pieces to start coming together. So there's kind of a couple layers of thinking and building and tying in trying to wrap everything up nicely when it comes to what we've got going on this season. And in addition to that, definitely other novels sort of on the horizon. There's a Lady Ethel book to write for, which will probably take a little bit of a backseat for a week or two while I just write ahead for the Hallowoods. But that will really kick into work probably more like late August, over a couple of months, and see if I can get the book done in that time. And then really, I think for now, the other priority for the show is just getting a couple episodes ahead of where we are currently, because there is a lot of travel coming up for me personally. A little bit of a week's trip at the end of June, then more like a 2 or 3 week trip at the end of July. So there's a couple of gaps where it would be good to have like a more of a backlog sort of to tide us over. I'm not anticipating any sort of breaks in the narrative or any weeks off for the listener side, but stay posted. We'll see. We'll do our best to avoid it, but it's sometimes a possibility when it comes to a weekly show. That said, those should be a good times as well, especially towards the August break, because I will be down at Gen Con and other podcasters sometimes frequent there too. So it might be a nice chance to meet some of the voice actors or fellow creators that I've gotten to meet through podcasting, which would be sweet. And especially for instance, on the Somewhere Ohio stream, we participated in a actual play, sort of like 4-hour, I think it was that long, episode for a game called Triangle Agency. And that was a lovely one shot. Very much enjoyed that casting crew. But the DM was the creator of Triangle Agency, and I know he'll be at Gen Con. So there's a couple of people who operate more in the actual play and games space that probably we'll see around there as well, which would be neat. In the meantime, we do have some questions from the patrons ask box. So I will begin working my way through those. And then after that, I'll get to any questions that may have popped up in the chat during that time. So Larnie Bruce says, "Hi, Mixwellman. Thank you so much for opening your commissions up. I received my Burn and Violet morning routine sketch last week, and it is framed in my bedroom. It makes my own mornings with my partner something special while we drink our own coffee, which is lovely. I'm so glad all those sketches, as far as I know, made it out to their right homes. I haven't had any people write in yet saying that their sketches were missing. If you haven't received your sketch in the mail by this point, it might not be the worst thing to reach out to me. But otherwise, I would hope this last batch of them has mostly found their way out to the world at this point. Although sometimes when you're mailing a letter to Australia, I don't know what happens, what sort of like journey through the Bermuda Triangle it goes through, but sometimes those do take a little bit of time. Larnie's first question: with your experience and understanding on TTRPGs, which is, for the layman's crowd, a tabletop role-playing game, have you ever considered creating a Hello from the Hallowoods TTRPG, much like the Magnus Archives, Old Gods, or the Silt Verses? I could imagine mechanics involving the Blackwater and it affecting characters over time. The answer is yes, absolutely. It's been on kind of the wish list of things I need to work on at some point for probably close to 2 years now, just kind of idly. I think even a little work has been done at times beginning to figure out how the mechanics of that would flesh out. But I will say my perception of TTRPGs has changed a little bit. I'm beginning to understand more different like styles of how they work. I'm playing more games. I'm learning more rules. So I think the vision of how that could play is changing a little bit from like sort of very D20 based, like, you know, kind of Dungeons and Dragons style play to something a little bit more narratively driven or kind of storybook based. I've enjoyed what I've seen played from Monster of the Week, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, I think. I've really enjoyed what I've gotten to play of Blades in the Dark. There's a couple games that operate more with players having the chance to bend the story and having that be the set of mechanics rather than like a more of a combat focused game or a game that prioritizes that frequently. Not that you shouldn't still be able to, you know, go fend off a giant fox or punch a froglin or, you know, set an old man's house on fire from time to time. But, you know, I imagine a lot of stories might not be centered around that kind of like protective violence. So, you know, the challenge would be in sculpting a game that allowed the players to tell the kinds of stories they would like to tell. But it is on my list for sure. It's being held up in consideration. I especially would love to dabble with like fancy game elements, especially if I could somehow combine the functions of an RPG with utilizing like a deck of tarot cards or a deck of Hallowoods tarot cards. There could be some fun stuff there when it comes to like unusual ways to play the game. But as you mentioned, a bunch of other horror podcasts have also gotten their like Hallowoods Dice Win, says the chat. Oh, that would be a great merch item. That would be a wonderful item. That could be fun for sure. But that said, there are a couple of other podcasts have done these. Actually, all of the like big three that I can think of have. The Magnus Protocol is launching their RPG, which is, I believe, a reskin of a different system that I haven't played before. Similar deal, I think, with Old Gods. I'm not sure if theirs is like working from a different games version or whether it is completely homebrewed. And I think Welcome to Night Vale is releasing an RPG soon with Renegade Game Studios, which is neat. So yeah, like all the cool podcasts are doing it. But it probably is a little bit further off for the Hallowoods because right now I have too many things to work on. Like there's a whole new novel that needs to be written first. But especially as things begin to take off, because really Hallowoods as a whole was originally seen as a bit of a starting point for getting fiction out there and eventually as a way to gather an audience to get some novels published. And as we get closer to the point where we actually have books on shelves, hopefully that should open up more time and opportunities, and just the ability to be in a place where I can manage my time just a little bit better. But that said, in the meantime, there is this like constant grind between making the show, between just normal life, and between trying to get other big projects like novels completed. So it's a juggling act for all of those. And sometimes it's hard to find space to like put an RPG in the works as well. But that said, it's certainly brewing. It probably will exist at one point. I can't guarantee when exactly yet. The chat says the Venn diagram between fiction podcasts and RPGs is rapidly becoming a circle. Absolutely. And the Silt Verses did one, I believe, which was connected to a system called Brindlewood Bay, perhaps. But that seems to be lovely. I need to find someone who's going to run a Silt Verses game, because that would be a lot of fun. But that said, yeah, when it comes to a Hallowoods RPG, mechanics like slowly changing due to Blackwater exposure, the ability for you to mix and match features would be important, I think, because there's just a world of random horror inspirations that exist out there. So it would be cool to have some of those powers and things be able to be combined or be as flexible as like your own original characters would demand, and not have to like fit into one particular class or bucket. I really like that the way character building works for the Renegade Game Studios Essence 20 family of games. And they've got a couple different like books in that system. They've got one for G.I. Joe, they've got one for Transformers, they've got one for My Little Pony, they've got one for Power Rangers, which none of those are games I would usually be that interested. Maybe Transformers. I have a soft spot for those. But in general, I probably wouldn't play a My Little Pony RPG. But the cool thing about their system is that each book comes with a big list of character inspirations, I think they're called, or elements or something like that. And it's basically a list of 20 attributes that your character could have. They could have like a certain type of magic. They could be like a bruiser. They could be big and bulky and strong. They could be a cannons expert and, just be really good at aiming and firing cannons. They could be a great tracker. And all of these books come with ones that are unique to the setting. So, your 20 or 50 are Power Rangers ones are all going to be stuff, like martial arts or using technology or summoning giant robots, whatever the case is. But you can mix and match them between books. So even if you're playing a Transformer, if you're a Transformer that turns into a giant robot laser unicorn, then you could pull in stuff from the other books and you could use those inspirations. And so your character is always a combination of just a couple different things that your character does well. And you get some perks and some powers and some things that happen as you level up from each of those inspirations. But your own character could be a mix match of, 3 or 4 things that all combine. So I really like that system. And when it's the case of like, okay, your character is undead, but undead in what variety? Are you more like a ghost and have ghostly attributes, or were you made out of parts? And then, what kind of parts were you made out of, and some of those things. But that would be fun to be able to kind of provide an array of options and let people build their own characters to some extent, and not always have to play as like an archetype that we see in the show, or dream up combinations we haven't seen in the show. So that would be some of the thoughts I would have around an RPG. Learning has a couple questions here. One of them is, Hallowoods is one of the most ethically distributed and independent podcasts I've ever experienced. Your wide episode distribution, including YouTube for free, No ads run on Spotify. Your work with the Skull Sessions to use the platform to spread the word about other excellent horror podcasts out there. How did you investigate the best ways to distribute Hallowoods, or was it all just logistically simple to choose? I would say it hasn't always been logistically simple. Um, and early on, there was definitely the choice. Because I had, I'd come out of marketing business school. I had looked at what all the other podcasts in this space were doing. And I had to sit down and kind of math out a couple of choices. There's a couple ways to make there's not a huge number of established ways to make money off of podcasts. And a couple of them are options like advertising, where you take in sponsors from ads and they put their ad material on your show. There are host-read ads where the McElroy brothers tell you about a great mattress that I'm sure they sleep on for 5 minutes in the middle of the show. You can get sponsors, which isn't always like direct ad placement, but you just kind of have like an ongoing relationship and you spread the news about them as frequently as possible. And they give you money for doing that. Some of those also you can't really do off the bat. Your value for advertisers doesn't really show up until you have an audience later. Your value for sponsors really doesn't show up until you have an audience. And then there are other things, just being part of a network is one of them, because the network usually handles the advertising relationships and the network decides what ads, more or less when and where ads go on your show, and the network gets a cut of ads of the money that's made from it. But they reward you with other perks for being in the network, like relationships with the other networkees, the ability to not really have to worry about the advertising side so much because they take care of it. Publicity, usually, because if the network is good, they should be investing in marketing for their shows. All of this was stuff that I was looking at the start. And I think I really wanted to be able, with Lady Ethel's segments, to kind of critique the idea that, in maybe a way that I know is overly naive or overly optimistic, but I resent on a spiritual level that so many wonderful artists and creators that fill the podcasting space have to sell portions of their time so that upon their canvas you can see logos for BetterHelp or socks or mattresses or meal boxes. I know it's the world we live in where people need to make money and corporations have money, but I wish they could just make art and do that and be fine, like be rewarded for doing that without having to endorse products. There's something kind of sad and dystopian about it. So that was a lot of the inspiration for Lady Ethel butting into the show to sell post-apocalyptic dream escape technology. But I also knew that I couldn't, in good conscience, both critique that practice and then at the same time have ads on the show. And any combination I could think of, like Lady Ethel presenting ads for different companies, would just be like the worst possible light to sell that stuff in the first place. Okay, we're going to sell you socks, but then the socks have to exist in the canon of the world in 2050, and she's got to be making fun of it. It wasn't going to work. And I didn't want to pollute the ears of the audience that way necessarily, which left us with pretty much just one of two options. Option one is that you can kickstart shows via crowdfunding. And that means that you're trying to recruit upfront to get people to invest in the costs of making a season. And you see a number of shows doing this, but the problem is usually you can raise whatever you can and then carry on. But I didn't have an audience at the time. I didn't know anyone in audio drama. So my likelihood of getting support for that seemed like zero. And then secondly, or if not zero, a couple of $100 maybe. The other side was, and this is the route that we ended up going for, having it be patron supported, which fit the model I was looking for, because I didn't want this to be just like one-off seasons. I wanted this to be as much of like a weekly radio show as you can really get. And so, it being weekly was important. It really fit well, I think, to look to the audience for that support and have people just of their own volition pitch in over time to help it get made. Um, and likewise, I liked the idea in this big complex spider web of a story, to be able to add little extra tidbits and insights and bonus stories and just flashes of other perspectives. And offering that as Patreon content made a lot of sense. So that was kind of the formula we landed on. And while the risk with it is that there's no guarantee you'll ever make money from it, it's entirely based on the generosity of your listenership, and their good graces and them just wanting to help the show keep existing. It also can be very slow. At least, for the first year, and we just were blessed so much more than most shows get to be. But the support really took off in the first year for this show. But there was a point, especially for like the first 6 months, where our listenership was almost zero and our Patreon was almost zero. And it was just continuing to produce it every week, knowing that like in a year or in 10 years, sometime, it might just have a little bit more support than it did. And it was very lucky that it sort of took off when it did and had people tuning in at a rate to put us up to a place where working on the show mostly full time is like somewhat substantial. But it's difficult to get there, and it can take a lot more time than it ended up taking for us in general. That said, definitely as the show has gone on, there have certainly been people approaching us over various opportunities, both advertisers, being like, well, there could be an extra $1,000 a month in the number of downloads that you get. And then other places, other networks being like, hey, well, you could join our network. You could get these benefits. But there's something of a loss of creative control that you see in both cases, where an audience that I had previously committed to presenting an ad free story to, would suddenly get bombarded by ads for literally who knows, because you often don't learn about what ads are going up until they're on your show. And then the networks just adds kind of a middleman to that same issue. So I've refrained from both taking up any advertisers or any networks. The only thing that you'll see on the show at this point is usually recommendations for other shows, especially shows from people that I know that are making cool stuff. I believe we have like a little promo spot going for Dead Space Deep Cover, which is a sci-fi show, but it's made by the folks behind Ealer's Choice, which is a show I like a lot. So it's not always logistically simple to choose, and I think the way that we've done it cuts off our opportunity for certain types of support, but it prioritizes the audience's comfort and providing an ad-free space in a very ad-filled world, and also allowing me to talk freely about stuff like advertising without also participating in that particular system. So I'm happy on all those fronts. If you listen to podcasts with ads, it's not that like there's some moral elements to it, but it purely is that there's only so many ways that people know of right now to make money from podcasts, and they have to find support somewhere in order to make podcasts. So sometimes selling socks or mattresses or meal boxes is just the best that you can do to make those ends meet and keep making the show. So that's as it goes. Question 3. Before Hallowoods, what was your day job? What was your life before the Hallowoods? I had just at the time of beginning Hello from the Hallowoods come off of a business marketing degree. And so at the time that I started making the Hallowoods, I was still employed as a business marketer, sort of like jack of all trades for a small entrepreneur. So I was making websites, I was making lead generation funnels, I was doing digital advertising, I was making audio and video content for specific like marketing clients across the Canada, the United States. And the more I did it, the more I really felt like there's a bit of a fish oil salesman thing going on where so much of digital marketing is a numbers game and a psychology game. Um, and you're really just trying to stack the odds on both of those elements as much as you can to make money. And I didn't, it wasn't work that appealed to me in the slightest. It was, I think, a good opportunity for me to get some useful skills, especially when it came to project management. I would say that learning project management through that job has really allowed me to be fairly efficient at making sure stuff gets done for the Hallowoods. Not always on time, but still it gets done more often than not. Whereas, if I hadn't gone through that work experience, I probably wouldn't be as on track with keeping up with all our various timetables. But that said, I knew that I wanted to get out of it. So it was really a question of I'll work this job or jobs like it until Hallowoods picks up enough to allow me to leave this and like start working mostly on writing fiction. And thankfully, it only took a year or a year and a half to reach that point. Uh, Actually, it might have been closer to 2 years, but by the end of that, it was to the point where the Hallowoods income was not nearly as much as I was making as a marketing associate or marketing manager, but it was at least enough that it would barely pay the rent. It would barely pay for groceries, and I could get by. And I would rather get by and be in poverty, but to be doing something that I really enjoy doing over doing something that pays well, but takes the soul out of you and removes your hours of life. So I was happy to kind of escape from that career path. Thankfully, I haven't had to look back to it just yet. As rent and other expenses rise higher, Hallowoods is, I would say, no longer quite like paying all the bills that I needed to pay. However, I've taken up other work recently as a dungeon master on the website Start Playing, where I'm running a couple professional D&D games for various people. We've got 2 campaigns at the moment, I believe, and that is allowing me to do something I enjoy and filling in the gaps as well. So, yeah, we're looking for ways to continue making writing and these kinds of projects viable without turning back to marketing as a whole. So that is where we find it. Lastly, from the patrons ask box, although I see a question in the chat, which we'll get to in a moment. River asks, "Hi, McSwellman. I love your work. I have 1,000 compliments I could give. Very touching, but I'll keep it brief. I'm developing my own audio drama, and the Hallowoods has been a huge inspiration. I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit about your process finding music to score the show. In the episode notes, you say you find music through artlist.io, so I was wondering how you came to that decision and what other options you considered, and whether a subscription to a platform like Artlist is something you'd recommend. Again, thank you for all you do, and I hope you have a wonderful week." Thank you very much. Yes, our dirty little secret for the Hallowoods is that all our music comes from an online library called artlist.io. We pay them either a large amount per year or medium amount per month in order to use their library of cinematic and like just millions of tracks probably, but we aim for a very particular vibe. I would say this was one of the decisions by we is the royal we. I mean, I had to make early on was where the money goes for the show. Using Adobe products does take money by itself. Unfortunately, we're still on that train. The other thing is that I really wanted it to sound fairly high quality, or at least as good as I could do at the time. And I knew that music was an important element for the kind of story that I wanted to tell. You don't always need it. Many shows I can think of don't have like music backing going in the background. You can also get friends or digital composers or people on SoundCloud to like make stuff for you. Rat Grimes of somewhere Ohio takes music commissions for very decent prices, I would say. And so for Star-Crossed Gods, we got a number of sort of like Fly Me to the Moon variants to use on that show. And those were composed bespoke by Rat Grimes, which was great. However, it was a priority for this show in particular that I wanted to have these atmospheric kind of tracks selling the story. I wanted to break up the sound of this single narrator as much as possible by like providing more diversity in the like soundtracks and the depth of it. And so it was a high price to pay, but it was worth it for this particular show. The only downside to using a music library is that, especially as other podcasters step into the space, more and more people are pulling from that same library. And in particular, Artlist.io doesn't just service podcasts. They do TV ads, YouTubers use them. And apparently, and I've only learned this in the years since, but our consistent like outro music is Farewell by Mile Beslitzman and Matana Frut. And apparently this particular track is just incredibly popular for YouTubers, for how-to videos, for ads, for insurance and cars and various things, because it's a nice waltzy, like cello, violin type piece. And so everywhere that people go, they're like, hey, it's the Hallowoods outro. It's like, yeah, they sure do love that one. And there's a couple of others that pop up occasionally from time to time. It will not be as unique as having your own bespoke music composed. But that said, it made sense for this show and continues to make sense for this show. Especially for me, it would at some point we might look into getting a little bit more music made bespoke for the Hallowoods. But in the meantime, there's often 40 minutes of music that I need per episode. And outside of certain characters who are tied to certain songs, I often try not to use the same songs 2 episodes in a row so that binge listeners aren't like listening to the same thing twice in a row. So that means like each season has a pretty in-depth library of soundtracks. I do try to keep it somewhat condensed. If you hear a song once, I try to make sure you'll hear it multiple times. I consider it part of the like album of that season, if you will. But often, we're looking at 30 to 40 soundtracks that make up the music in a season. And so I think was one of the reasons why we haven't opted to get bespoke music. We have it going almost all the time. You might not even always notice it just as your brain tunes out the background, but it's always there for the most part, one or two specific scenes aside. So just the sheer quantity of time that we had to fill was one of the other factors. Whereas if you had, just like 5 soundtracks of various moods made for you, you could probably get, a full season of 15-minute episodes out of that really easily. So those are some of the factors to consider. Stay away from Farewell by Melba Sitzman and Matana Frut, or we'll see it everywhere. But yeah, that's just some of the things that come up. Lastly, Beanie in the chat says, "Are you aware of the day X of saying I miss Rick Rounds every day until we find out what happens to him? Counter someone's doing on Discord. It reached 100 days yesterday." That can't. What month is it? June. It might be 100 days since Valentine's Day, but we got a little bit of an update in the My Love from the Moormire short story collection, and it is a very short story collection. It's almost like 5 drabbles and some love letters, printable Valentine's cards. That is a like a PDF you can get on the Hallowoods Patreon in our little shop. But that was written for Valentine's Day this year. And it contains updates on a few characters during the time skip. Um, I can't say most of them are characters you actually wanted to check in on. Like, I think one of them is just that Grug is now in a Romeo and Juliet frog relationship, among like the Logmalog cult versus the Froglin Queen cult. I think we check in with Horace Loveland from the Writer Out of Time miniseries. It's all, I mean, it's like small whimsical bits. But we do check in a little bit on Rick's current journey. I don't know. I don't know. We'll stay tuned. I'm sure he'll grace the main show at some point. But I was very fond of the note that he got in this Valentine's Day collection that no one has ever seen or heard of or read. So we'll see. We'll see. But he's I can't say he's living his best life or even living a life, but it's a life. Working on it. So that is probably where we'll leave off for today. But thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Hope you enjoy this Wednesday's new and forthcoming first episode of the last half of season 4. And stay tuned for more. See you around the bend, everybody. Toodles.